மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
Welcome to chapter 8, which is going to be all about stalemate. And I know that stalemate is something that has probably plagued every single chess player out there. We've all had games that unfortunately ended in stalemate. And my feeling is that stalemate is one of those tricky themes, mainly because it doesn't come up that often in games, and so we tend to forget about it until it's too late. So for me, the trick with stalemate is just remembering that it is a thing, it is an idea that exists in chess, and a very, very important concept to watch out for. Essentially, to me, it's like a kind of tactic. Now, there are many positions where stalemates are totally unexpected because there's multiple pieces on the board, and so our brain just naturally doesn't think about the possibility of stalemate. And hopefully this chapter will kind of help you break through that mode of thinking to help you realize that there can be many cases where stalemate is a possibility. Take this position, for example, which comes from a study from the great Alexei Trotsky, and this one is white to play and draw. And it seems like white is in big trouble here because the rook on a3 is under attack and black is a g-pawn that is about to promote. So how can white save this position? Rook to g3 just gets taken, and it seems like the king is too far away to stop the pawn. Again, the rook is still hanging. So it looks like white is totally lost. The only chance here is to try to set up some kind of stalemate. So white has a really miraculous shot here, and it's these kinds of puzzles that I think really make you a better player and a much sharper player overall. Because a lot of players look at this position, they look at their possibilities, and this is a position where one might resign in a game because it just seems like there's nothing white can do and the game is just over, which is where it's very important simply not to give up and to really exhaust all possible resources. As it turns out, white can play this move, rook to g3, which is a really, really incredible move. Because it's a move that I think most players would just immediately rule out because of bishop takes g3. But if you're clever enough here and you don't make the move king takes g3 in your mind too quickly, you might realize that we're not forced to recapture. White has this move king h3, attacking the g2 pawn, and all of a sudden, if black promotes to a queen, or a rook for that matter, then we get a stalemate. White's king on h3 ends up out of moves. And if black promotes to a knight, for example, trying to win the endgame with the extra pawn, well, after king takes g3, black's knight has no way of defending this h5 pawn, and it turns out white is holding the draw. For example, knight e2 check, king h4, knight f4, king to g5. Next move, white is either taking the knight and then coming back for the pawn, or the knight has to move and white is just taking the last pawn and making the draw. So a really, really incredible idea. And of course, I have to point out here that if black decides to just give the g pawn and play something like h4, well, then white is playing king to takes g2 here, and this is a theoretical draw as well, as black has the wrong color bishop with the rook pawn. Another idea that doesn't come up too often, the wrong color bishop, but one that will come up in studies and of course in endgames all the time, and a really important endgame to remember, that black actually can't win this one if they can't promote their h-pawn here. So a really, really remarkable resource. For me, the hardest part of this is just seeing that king takes g3 is not the only move here and that you can actually consider different moves here. Most people, when they analyze this line, they probably just reject rook to g3 without even considering it for very long at all. And later on in this course, we're going to have a chapter on this idea of mental agility, which is basically one's ability to kind of switch between lines and really remain flexible in your thinking. I think seeing enough of these types of tricks and ideas, which come up in endgame studies quite a bit, by ideas, I mean this idea of like not recapturing the bishop and instead finding the super sneaky move king to h3. For me, this is actually kind of comes down to pattern recognition and just seeing examples of this kind of thing. So the more studies you find with really cool tricks like this, the more I think your brain will become better at seeing these ideas and spotting these resources yourself. So a really, really cool trick here with king to h3, and all of a sudden black has no way to avoid a draw with an extra bishop and 2 pawns. Either we have an immediate stalemate on the board, or white is getting one of these theoretical endgames. And yeah, with that, let's take a look at another example that you might see in this chapter. So this next one is puzzle number 7 in the chapter. This is a study by Duras from 1925. And this is a really typical type of stalemate problem that you might see in endgame studies. All of the puzzles in this chapter will be asking you to set up a stalemate, which means the problems will be white to play and draw, as this one is. And as we can see, once again, black has a very far advanced passed pawn. This pawn on a2 is about to promote, and white's rook on b8 is in no position to stop this pawn. There's simply nothing that the rook can do. But instead of resigning, white can keep the game going here with a really, really nice resource. And here the trick is to try to calculate where black's queen will be when black promotes. So in this case, the a1 square. So there's going to be a queen on a1. And trying to figure out how we can possibly force a stalemate, given that we have an extra move. We have one move here, then black will promote, and then our next move has to somehow force a stalemate. Now, it's much easier when you know the theme, of course, but that's the point of this practice and training, is to kind of develop this vision for our future solving. So with that, I'd invite you to pause the video and try to figure it out, how you can possibly force a draw here. Again, you get one move with the rook, then black will promote, and then you have to find some kind of tactic or trick there to force a stalemate. Okay, so if you want more time, definitely pause the video. Well, here white starts with the move rook to b4. Very, very accurate move. Very, very precise. White is threatening the immediate rook a4 check, which would just pick up the a2 pawn. So black is kind of forced to promote. And here comes white's point. White simply plays rook a4 check anyway, forking the king and the queen. A very forcing move. Black's queen is forced to take the rook. Otherwise, white will take the queen and be up a rook in the endgame. And after queen takes a4, of course, as we can see, we have a really nice stalemate on the board. White's king simply has no squares to go to. And the way white kind of figured this one out, simply just by calculating that, well, once the queen is on a4, all of these squares are going to be covered. This is the only place where this would work. That's why a move like rook to b3 doesn't work, because on rook a3, that's not going to be a stalemate. And same with rook to b5 and any other move. So this is one where essentially you have to solve almost by working backwards and trying to place the king into a checkmate, into a stalemate. But of course, this is the trick with these puzzles and what makes them so interesting and fun, and also sometimes a little frustrating as well. But with that, I'm going to leave you to it to solve the rest of the puzzles in this chapter. You're going to have to look for a lot of stalemates, so be really creative about where your king is and what squares you need to take away. And keep in mind that some of these puzzles might be drawn in different ways. For instance, the previous puzzle, there was some themes of having walking into a theoretical endgame with the king against the wrong color bishop and rook pawn. So keep in mind that not all of these puzzles might be drawn by stalemate in the end, but stalemate is of course going to be a very, very critical theme. Okay, with that, I'll wish you the best of luck, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Take care.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.